Well, in many of my previous videos we explored the Dark Souls lore through etymology of the names of its characters and locations. In today's video, however, I'd like to discuss some interesting things from the architecture and location design concept approach. Actually, this was one of my very first ideas for a video back in April, but as I'm not really an expert in architecture and back then I only had some intuitive impressions which I wasn't 100% certain about, I wanted to do some research about some of the things first to be more certain. So, let's finally talk about this stuff. I guess yet another of many reasons the Dark Souls games are loved for is that beautiful and actually interesting location design. Often the locations are not quite linear, with all the different ways and shortcuts that are eventually opened as one progresses through the location. And, of course, rather often developers use real-life inspirations in their architecture designs. However, today I'd like to discuss that the architecture concepts in these games might actually be a little deeper than simply designs for particular locations, as it seems that the architecture style choices actually rather consistently represent the lore about the given locations. And it's possibly even like that the architecturally related, but different, designs of different locations might be actually reflecting a lore-wise relation between such locations. So, possibly the most easily recognizable real-life inspiration is seen on the Archdragon Peak location. The Dragon-Kin Mausoleum, which is pretty obviously inspired by the Hagia Sophia Patriarchal Basilica, and later a mosque, of Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. In fact, this reference is so obvious that it actually wasn't the subject I required to do some research to be certain about. A rather iconic building, Hagia Sophia is considered to be an epitome of the Byzantine architecture. And actually it seems that Byzantine culture was picked as a basis for the entire Archdragon Peak location. However, that doesn't mean that the devs couldn't occasionally mix the other inspirations in. In addition to the architecture, that obviously features some clearly Byzantine designs, we may also note that the paintings on the shields depicting an ancient dragon used by the Serpent people, which are said to be a result of an exquisite but painstaking technique, are in fact somewhat reminiscent of Byzantine mosaic icons. So taking all of this into account, I guess we may say that in Dark Souls world, this particular Byzantine-inspired style is now associated with the entire dragon worship culture, as similar architecture may be found in other places related to the dragon worship. For instance, within the territory of the Lothric castle, there's a certain place which seems to be built in a rather different style from the Gothic architecture of the rest of the location. Namely, the building where we find the consumed King Oseros, or rather magic, bewitched, monster King Osros as we discussed in one of my previous etymology videos. In this place we also find the Serpent Men, and, in fact it's actually required to visit this location in order to learn the path of the dragon gesture, which is necessary to reach the Archdragon Peak in the first place. So this building in the consumed King's Garden is obviously related to dragon worship. And the peculiar thing about this place is that it has a lot of common with the Archdragon Peak also in architectural aspect. For example, on the floor in the consumed King's Garden we may see some mosaics, which are actually pretty similar to the real-life Byzantine floor mosaics, and are in fact the same as those of the Archdragon Peak. In addition to that, the archway above the entrance that leads us to the consumed king has actually pretty much the same design that those we may see on the Archdragon Peak, only it's somewhat larger. And, basically the interior of this building also gives this somewhat Byzantine impression with those arches and domes. Well, actually if we look at it from the outside we can see it more clearly with those domes, only in such case they're seen somewhat inside out. However, I guess the silhouette gives the similarity away better. But what is such a different building doing on the territory of the Lothric castle? Perhaps it was built that way in imitation of the Archdragon Peak by Oseros, who was obsessed with dragons and creation of a perfect heir. Well, while I guess that such possibility can't be ruled out completely, I think that everything might be pretty much the other way around, as this building actually seems to be older than the rest of the location, both comparing its architectural style to that of Lothric Castle, which appears to be more modern, as it's inspired by the real-life architecture of a later historical period. And looking at the state of this building, which is pretty much damaged, with all those roots growing in through the broken roof. Also the vines on the broken facade make the building appear old and somewhat forlorn, unlike the nearby towers of the castle. In addition to that, at the entrance to the Oseros building, we may find some bas-reliefs depicting some scribes, scholars, with books and quills in their hands. And, actually the entire floor, the walls of the building are tiled with stone plates, engraved with some, apparently ancient, texts. Actually, even the doors have some text on them. So, it seems that earlier this building used to be a library of sorts, rather than a place of dragon worship, and, what's even more interesting, is that the text engraved plates we've mentioned, are pretty much the same that we may find in the Firelink shrine area. However, even more obviously, in the consumed King's Garden building we find a stone lord vessel, similar to one we find among the ruins in Cemetery Vash, untended graves location, and at which we see below the Firelink shrine bonfire. And basically the untended graves, dark Firelink shrine areas are accessed exactly through Oseros library. So the library building seems to be older than the Lothric castle, that was built beside it only later. And it's actually possible that the building of consumed King's Garden was initially built as a part of a single complex of buildings with the old Firelink shrine, or at least was built in a roughly the same period. And, speaking of the Firelink shrine, it really seems that it also has a lot of Byzantine elements about itself, though different from those of the Archdragon peak. In fact, the Firelink shrine building seems to be quite similar to some of the Byzantine, both geographically and Byzantine influenced in style, Christian churches. And actually it's exactly the subject I required a little consultation to be certain about. We can see that some classical Byzantine-style churches often feature the dome, arches, other element designs reminiscent of what we see in the Firelink shrine building. So it gives somewhat a Byzantine impression. However, I must note that strictly speaking it's a little difficult to say for sure, as Byzantine Empire, or Eastern Roman Empire, was in fact still considered a single state with the Western Roman Empire, even after the death of Emperor Theodosius I. So, naturally, Byzantine and Roman architectures were related, and we may also see some Byzantine architectural influences on the territory of the western part of the empire either. And actually the Byzantine architecture is also sometimes referred as later Roman architecture. So, even though it's possible to differ in real life, I guess in case with fictional places it's way harder as the developers could pick to mix various elements together in one location. For instance, in Oalisile we can see both Roman, most obviously the Colosseum Tower, and Byzantine elements, like those domes. So I wouldn't go that far to say that the Firelink shrine is built in a 100% pure Byzantine style, but it at least is rather similar to Byzantine, later Roman churches, having some elements of Byzantine-inspired architecture about itself. However, the modern Firelink shrine seems to be placed near the ruins of older, larger building, which also seems to have initially been built in a somewhat Byzantine-influenced style. For example, these arches found all over the place seem to be somewhat reminiscent of the ruins of pretty much Byzantine-inspired Archdragon peak. And, although it could be just a coincidence, the small bell we find at the Cemetery Vash has a similar design to that small bell we find on the Archdragon peak. In any case, I believe that it's quite interesting that the Firelink shrine location, which is obviously an important place for the Way of White. As for example, we know Way of White sends its maidens to become firekeepers of the shrine, as was Anastasia of Dark Souls 1, has something in common with the dragon worship building of the consumed King's Garden. And at the same time also seems to be inspired by historical late Roman Byzantine architecture, thus possibly related to that Byzantine architecture of the Archdragon peak. And why on the territory of Lothric Castle there is a building built in dragon worship traditions of Archdragon peak, which actually looks older than the castle itself and could be actually connected to the Firelink shrine in the first place. Actually, I think that it's not a mere coincidence. Yet, of course, that's also possible, but might rather be a part of a certain single concept. And to discuss this matter in more detail, let's return to the Archdragon peak and its real-life inspiration, Hagia Sophia. So, Hagia Sophia was built in the year 537 as a basilica, and was in fact a third church built at the same site, after the destruction of the two previous. Being larger and more majestic than its predecessors, it became the seat of the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople and a principal setting for Byzantine imperial ceremonies, such as coronations. And it actually used to be the world's largest cathedral for about 1,000 years until 1520. Also, for a period of almost 60 years it had also been a Roman Catholic cathedral during the Latin occupation of Constantinople of 1204 to 1261. and was said to have been in dilapidated state after the recapture of the city by Byzantines. However, it was ultimately turned into a mosque after being pillaged by the forces of Sultan Mehmed II in result of the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople of 1453. And, actually I believe that there might be a certain parallel between the Archdragon Peak and the historical fate of Hagia Sophia Cathedral. For, it seems that, similarly to Hagia Sophia, which hasn't always been a mosque, the entire complex of the Archdragon Peak buildings hasn't always been a place of dragon worship either. Well, most obviously we see the statues of Gwyn's firstborn, the dragon-slaying god of war, whom we now know as the Nameless King. But as we know, at some point he allied himself with dragons. So strictly speaking, we can't take it as an argument showing that the place wasn't always a center of dragon worship just like that, without discussing a couple of other points. For instance, one point is that although this building is now called a Dragonkin Mausoleum, in fact it doesn't appear to be a real mausoleum at all, as the bodies of the dragon-turned creatures seem to be simply sitting all over the room. That doesn't really look much like a place meant for burials. Also, we could see a peculiar sun symbol on the chalices that can be found all over this place. And this symbol is quite reminiscent of the symbol of the Warriors of Sunlight, who were once led by Gwyn's firstborn, whose symbol it was initially, back in the times when he still was a god of war and heir to the lightning. So, having all of that together, I guess it really appears that initially Archdragon Peak actually used to be a shrine of the Nameless King, back when he still was a dragon-slaying god. And as we can see a corpse of an Archdragon on the mountain beside the temple complex. We may assume that it's possibly built on the ancient site of victory against dragons once achieved by the Nameless King, and thus it once used to be a sacred place for the Sunlight Warriors Covenant. In such case, if those dead dragons had already been present prior to the conversion into a dragon worship shrine, they were rather trophies on display than a dead bodies in a mausoleum. But, in any case, what's really peculiar is that the Archdragon Peak, with its Byzantine-inspired design, seems to be initially a shrine of one of the old gods, and a really ancient one, dating back to really early Age of Fire, built prior to the defection of Gwyn's firstborn. And I deem it to be extremely interesting, as it might hint that in fact one of the ideas behind the Dark Souls world architecture concept is that the use of different later Roman, Byzantine, early Christian-inspired designs corresponds to ancient shrines of the early Age of Fire, related to the old gods and the early way of white outside Van Orlando. Somewhat similarly as the real-life Khmer architecture corresponded to Izalith, for example. As different Byzantine, later Roman elements are used in design of the Archdragon Peak, and also Firelink Shrine, which surely is one of the most important and ancient places in Dark Souls world, and particularly, for the religion of the Way of White. Another interesting thing is that the characters related to the Way of White, particularly its clerics, often have names of Greek origins, such as Petrus, Anastasia, Rhea, Irina. With Anastasia and Irina being names pretty much associated with Orthodox Christian saints. In addition to that, in Dark Souls 1, the cleric class had the East-West shield, as a part of its starting equipment. While the double-headed eagle symbol was actually used in the real life as an emblem of the Eastern Roman Empire, and subsequently, Orthodox Christian Church. Which, however, might be just a coincidence, of course. But another interesting, though less certain, point is that the Way of White cleric armor set of Dark Souls 1 has some common features with some of the medieval Byzantine armor designs, for instance of Byzantine cataphract heavy cavalry, mainly like their lamellar armor, which was used really widely in Byzantine army and is somewhat associated with cataphract warriors. And also chainmails and such helmets with chainmail hoods, masks, especially encased with the elite cleric helm, seem to also be somewhat reminiscent of Byzantine armors. And although the concept of cataphract cavalry originates from Iranian peoples, the word cataphract is of a Greek origin, and I guess it still is pretty much associated with Byzantine army, as it adopted this type of troops. However, I'd like to note that it's not really a definite point, as lamellar armors were also spread among other peoples, both who had contacts with Byzantine Empire, and those who had contacts with peoples the Byzantines adopted this type of troops from in the first place. Yet, lamellar is pictured in many historical sources on Byzantine warriors, thus is still often associated with Byzantines. So this, possibly really vague, Byzantine impression of cleric armor is still quite interesting together with the rest of the stuff we discussed today. And, although it's a really huge and wild speculation, I guess that all of this might be actually different parts of a single concept, where the old way of White Church of the Gods has parallels with real-life Byzantine Empire, in architecture, character names, equipment and so on. So it might be actually like, if something in Dark Souls appears to be similar to real-life later Roman, Byzantine style, lore-wisely it's likely related to the Way of White, possibly also Old Thoroughland, and the Old Gods. Also, in the Cathedral of the Deep, which seems to have initially been a cathedral of the Way of White, we may find archways, somewhat similar, yet different, to those of the Archdragon beak. In fact, it has pretty much the same bas-relief texture, only applied in a different direction, which might be just a coincidence, a reused content, or be a further alteration of the old Way of White/Gwyn's Pantheon church motifs in a more modern cathedral. But let's return to the Archdragon beak. It seems that initially this location was an ancient, possibly the main, shrine of the Nameless King back when he was a dragon slayer god of war. Only, it is said that the Nameless King had sacrificed everything to ally himself with dragons, and so, following his defection, his worship in Lothric got banned, his very name was expunged from history, and his shrine of the Archdragon Peak became a center of dragon worship, likely by his own will, and eventually became populated with, apparently dragon-worshipping, serpent men. And in fact these events seem to also have strongly influenced the rest of the world, as we can see it on the example of Kingdom of Lothric. For, it is said that Lothric knights were once dragon hunters and worshippers of the sun. But, by the times of the game's events they are rather known as dragon-tamers. And it seems that the dragon barracks are in fact called so not as a sound epithet, but rather because a Wyvern squad had actually been stationed there. Only, sadly the Wyverns were also weak to the pus which now seems to control their shells. On the other hand, we can actually find the Lothric banners on the Archdragon beak. Pretty much the same banners we often see in Lothric Castle. And, of course, we also see some Lothric knights in the Irithil dungeon, who, apparently, died in their attempts to reach the Archdragon peak. However, as we can see by the banners on the peak, at some point, some of the Lothric knights have actually made it to get there, and so it seems that being sunlight warriors and worshippers of the sun, and thus, of the Nameless King, after finding out about his defection, Lothric knights followed him in his alliance with dragons, and learned the lore of taming dragons from him. And speaking of the origins of their old dragon hunting and sun worship, it might actually be coming from the old dragon slayer, who served the Nameless King and his first knight Ornstein the dragon slayer, and whose armor we may find in Lothric Castle. Thus Lothric's relation to the worship of the Nameless King might actually be tracing back to that dragon slayer himself, and relatively early age of old gods, which would fill some blanks about the library building of the consumed King's Garden that we discussed. As in such case, given the architectural similarities with the Archdragon Peak's shrine, it seems that it was initially an ancient building related to the cult of sun, which would make it an important place for early Lothric whose knights were known as sun worshippers, and possibly could even be spiritual descendants, followers of the ancient dragon slayer. However, with time this building became forlorn, and was eventually turned into a place of dragon worship, as the Nameless King, whom it likely had been related to, allied himself with dragons. And ultimately this building ended up being something we may call the Consumed King's Lair. And it's possible that exactly the turn from hunting dragons to taming them eventually caused Osero's fascination with dragons, which at some point got also intertwined with his obsession about creating a perfect heir, and altogether that eventually led him to attempts of turning himself into dragon, and creating a child of dragons. However, it's pretty much a speculation and is only one of possible views on this situation, as it is still might be somewhat possible that the Osero's library was built on his order as an imitation only. Or for example, that the defection of the Gwyn's firstborn was only discovered by Lothric in an expedition, sent by dragon-obsessed Oseros to find the Archdragon Peak. And in fact it could fit some of our older wild speculations, about Sullivan being a scholar of Lothric Grand Archives at some point of the story, and discovering the profaned capital as he, along with expedition of Lothric knights, was searching for the ways to reach the Archdragon Peak below Irithil, but that's a separate topic really, and, in fact, almost baseless speculations. As for the things we've mentioned today, I'd like to use the opportunity of this video to discuss a couple of peculiar things related to them. The first one is that Red Bridge Wyvern of Dark Souls 1, whom we find above the Altar of Sunlight, which is now ruined, as it venerated the Gwyn's Firstborn. Having the new things we found about the Gwyn's Firstborn in Dark Souls 3, it actually gives a whole new meaning to this scene. As now it seems more like that the Wyvern's actually guarding the altar of his friend, ally. And that would explain why he leaves his spot once he fails to prevent us from reaching the Sunlight Altar. Also, as for the Serpent people we mentioned, who are somewhat traditional for the FromSoft's games, as the Moonlight Greatsword is. I guess that it's them, in first place, to whom refers a description of the covetous serpent rings, that tells about serpents as imperfect dragons that could be, but never were, dragons. As in Dark Souls 1 we actually find one of the rings in the Sense Fortress populated by these serpent people, and also the text about serpent greed, which is similar to that of the ring's description, may be found in the description of Medicant's staff wielded by apparently female serpents. Thus it's likely jealousy the serpent people had about the dragons, as their lost chance to become mightier could be the reason both why some of them worshipped dragons in attempts to become them through Pass of the Dragon, and also, as we see in Dark Souls 1, where some of serpent people guarded the Sense Fortress, and used lightning, which is associated with Lord Gwyn. They likely served the lords who fought against the dragons, that they could never become equal to, even being their relatives. And speaking of the Sense Fortress, it's possible that these serpent people could in fact have originated from there, as they're able to summon a spirit with Ricard's rapier in hands and a crown on his head. Thus probably it could be undead Prince Ricard himself, who, as we know from Dark Souls 1, followed attempting to brave the Sense Fortress. However, returning to the serpent rings, naturally it would be also extremely interesting if those very words about imperfect dragons were related to the primordial serpents, although they're quite different from the ordinary snakes depicted on the rings, as it would explain why some of them supported Lord Gwyn and other great lords in their war against the dragons, or possibly it were them who incited this war from behind the curtains in the first place. But that's a separate topic which isn't that related to the main subjects of today's video anyway, and, speaking of it, I guess that it will be pretty much all for this video, as, once again, it ends up being longer than I initially planned it to be, and also it might be quite difficult to watch, as it covers several topics and is completed from the old drafts I did back in April and May, when I was even less experienced in making of lore videos. So, thanks for watching. I hope that it was interesting for you and that it wasn't too difficult to watch. Also, check out other of lore, etymology and cosplay videos of my channel if you like. And you can also check out this video's description for a link to the etymology video's table of contents, if you're interested in this topic, as it's meant to make it easy to find the discussion of the necessary names.